What you heard were three short pieces by Maurice Ravel. The first two extremely seldom played, they're almost virtually unknown, tiny little miniatures. Maurice Ravel, born in 1875, lived till 1937, together with his compatriot in France, Claude Debussy, is considered to be one of the foremost composers of what we call the Impressionist era in classical music, which flourished roughly from the late 1890s into the second decade of the 20th century, with the first decade being the real peak of this period. I think the word Impressionism is correct to use for these composers and for music, because what they were trying to do was in a parallel way to what the Impressionist painters several decades earlier were doing. Those painters were working with new things with light and color to create shimmery, sensuous, and blurry effects on the eye. And what Ravel and Debussy were doing was to create shimmery, sensuous, blurry effects on the ear with new harmonies. And harmony really is pretty much everything in this music. This is what really draws you in. These harmonies just mix and melt out of each other. I like to use the word iridescent to describe what these harmonies do, like oil in water. When you drop it in water and you get all those shimmery colors. That's exactly what happens here. A lot of this music is what we call program music. It has descriptive titles, and the music pretty much does what the title is all about. This was my original favorite area. Even before I went to Juilliard, I was really drawn into the music of Debussy and Ravel. I'd heard recordings by the German pianist Walter Gieseking, who was acknowledged in the early part of the 20th century to be the foremost master of this kind of repertoire. And I was really drawn into that. And as time went on, because of that, I eventually learned and played in concert everything for piano that both Ravel and Debussy wrote. Now, Debussy wrote a lot more in quantity. It would take at least 4 full evenings or 4 full recitals to play everything for piano that Debussy wrote. But Ravel, it can be done to play the complete piano works of Ravel in one evening. I did that a couple of times. So you need like a 2.5 hour long concert with maybe 2 intermissions, but it can be done, and I did do that before. Both of these composers sometimes sound similar, especially in the works of that first decade of the 20th century, which is the peak decade for musical impressionism for both of these composers. And that's because they use some of the same harmonic techniques. But there are differences. Debussy's music tends to be more fragmentary. Ravel's is more ongoing and continuous. Ravel was a real craftsman in his music. There's a lot of finesse and polish. In fact, he was asked once to describe his music, and he said, in essence, my music is Mozart, nothing more. Of course, with his own harmonic language, but that same sort of finesse and elegance that Mozart's music has. As time went on, into the second, third decade of the 20th century, Ravel's music began to evolve into different directions. He was quite taken with jazz and Gershwin's music, and got involved in some of the new trends that were going on in the 1920s, what we now call a neoclassic style. But in the earlier period, I think especially around the first, maybe beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, his music was, similar to Debussy's in various ways, and using similar harmonies. Now, having kind of given you a little bit of a background of Ravel, and by the way, before I forget, my father met Ravel once. This was, I think, must have been around 1930, early 1930s. It was at a time, I think, when the French pianist Marguerite Long was playing his piano concerto around Europe. His impression of Ravel was just like virtually everyone. He was like a short little man, dressed like a little dandy, all polish and elegance. Well, it shows up in his music. Okay, now what you just heard here. 2 tiny pieces, there were 3 pieces, obviously, you heard. The first 2, extremely short. The first one was called Prelude, written in 1913, and he wrote it for a sight reading, for sight reading exam for a competition that the Conservatoire in Paris was holding at that time. That was the purpose for that first piece that you heard, extremely short. The second one is called Menuet sur le nom d'Haydn, Menuet on Haydn's name, Joseph Haydn, written in 1909. That was the centenary of Haydn's death, 1809. And there was a society in Paris, a musical society, that asked 6 composers to write pieces that would pay homage to Haydn. Debussy was another one among those 6. So this is Ravel's contribution. So he uses 5 notes within this little piece to spell out, sort of symbolically, the 5 letters of the name Haydn. So that's the purpose of that second piece that you heard. Now, the third one is considerably better known. It's actually from his formative period. It's not yet a fully mature work, 1899. But there are definitely harmonies in there that are already pointing the way to the future. That's called Pavane pour une enfant défunte. Pavane for a dead princess. Now, he didn't have a particular princess in mind. What he imagined was this was maybe something that could have been danced by a young princess. Now, Pavane was a slow processional dance that was popular in the royal courts in Europe in the 16th and 17th century. Now, in this particular piece, it also kind of evokes a certain nostalgia for Spain and the customs of Spain. Infant, well, of course, French, but it really means infanta, which in Spanish is a princess. But like I say, he didn't have any particular princess in mind and all that. But just kind of imagine maybe one dancing this. In fact, later he was asked why he chose that title, and he basically said, I just kind of like the sound of these words, really, to put it together. It's a fairly well-known work of Ravel. He orchestrated it in 1910, so you can occasionally hear it in that version. But like I say, it's an early piece, and it's still in his formative periods. Now, those other 2 little miniatures are already from his mature period, I already said. Prelude is 1913, and the other one, Menuet sur le nom d'Haydn, is 1909. So anyways, I wanted to play, but I also wanted to play it because my Steinway Model B, the 7-foot one, the second largest size, the one I practice on, was recently tuned up and so on, and I think it sounds really nice, and I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of an impression of also how it sounds like. Well, anyways, I hope you enjoyed this, and so have a listen, and there'll be something else coming up soon. Okay? Have a good evening or day or whatever, wherever you are.